The champagne flute slipped from my fingers and shattered against the marble floor of our penthouse, the crystal fragments catching the candlelight like tiny diamonds scattered across a battlefield. Marcus stood there in his perfectly tailored suit, the one I'd bought him for our 15th anniversary last year, holding a manila envelope that would change everything. His words still echoed in the elegant dining room, where I'd spent 3 hours preparing our anniversary dinner, where 23 years of marriage photos smiled down at us from the walls, mocking the moment that was about to destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Sterling, and at 45, I thought I had finally figured out what happiness looked like. I owned 3 successful boutique hotels across the Pacific Northwest, had built a reputation in the hospitality industry that opened doors I'd never dreamed of walking through, and had what everyone called the perfect marriage to Marcus Blackwood, a charming architect who specialized in luxury resorts. We lived in a penthouse overlooking the Seattle waterfront, drove matching Tesla vehicles, and attended charity galas where we were photographed as the golden couple who had it all. That Tuesday evening started like every October 14th for the past 5 years. I had closed my main office early, driven home through the autumn rain, and spent the afternoon transforming our dining room into something worthy of a magazine spread. White roses filled crystal vases, imported French wine breathed in a decanter that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and the scent of Marcus's favorite meal, herb-crusted lamb with rosemary potatoes, filled our home with the kind of warmth that money couldn't buy but love could create. I had changed into the burgundy silk dress that Marcus always said brought out the gold flecks in my brown eyes, the same dress I'd worn to our engagement party 24 years ago when we were just 2 ambitious kids who thought love and determination could conquer anything. My dark hair was swept up in the elegant chignon he'd always preferred, secured with the vintage pearl pins his grandmother had given me on our wedding day, and I wore the diamond necklace he'd surprised me with on our 10th anniversary, back when surprises meant jewelry instead of divorce papers. The table was set with our wedding china, the delicate porcelain pattern we'd chosen together during those blissful months of engagement when every decision felt momentous and every choice felt like the foundation of our forever. Soft jazz played from the hidden speakers Marcus had installed throughout the penthouse, the same playlist from our wedding reception, and I had even recreated the centerpiece from our engagement dinner. White candles in hurricane glasses surrounded by eucalyptus branches that reminded us both of the vineyard where he'd proposed. Everything was perfect except for the growing knot in my stomach that had been tightening for months, the nagging feeling that something fundamental had shifted in our marriage without me understanding when or why. Marcus had been working longer hours, traveling more frequently, and when he was home, he seemed distracted, always checking his phone, always having urgent calls that required him to step onto the balcony for privacy. I told myself it was stress from the major resort project he'd been designing in Napa Valley, the kind of career-defining opportunity that could establish him as one of the premier architects in luxury hospitality. I rationalized his distance as the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage, the comfortable silence that develops between 2 people who know each other so well that words become unnecessary. I convinced myself that the lack of physical intimacy was temporary, a side effect of our busy schedules and the exhaustion that comes with building successful careers in demanding industries. But deep down, in the part of my heart that I'd been trying to ignore, I knew something was wrong. The way he no longer asked about my day, the way he'd stopped mentioning future plans that included both of us, the way he looked at his phone with an expression I'd never seen before, tender and excited and completely absorbed in someone else's words. When I heard his key in the lock at exactly 7:30, I felt a flutter of nervous anticipation that reminded me of our early dating days. Maybe tonight would be the night we found our way back to each other. Maybe the romantic dinner, the thoughtful details, the obvious effort I'd put into making this anniversary special would remind him of what we'd built together, what we still had worth fighting for. Marcus walked into the dining room, carrying his briefcase and that manila envelope, and my first thought was that he'd brought work home on our anniversary. Again. My second thought was that he looked tired, older somehow, with new lines around his eyes, and a weariness in his posture that I hadn't noticed before. But when he saw the table, saw me standing there in the dress that used to make him smile, His expression didn't soften with appreciation or love or even recognition of the effort I'd made. Instead, he looked guilty, and sad, and determined in a way that made my chest tighten with a fear I didn't want to acknowledge. "Victoria," he said, and his voice carried a weight that made my hands start trembling. "We need to talk." The lamp was getting cold on the stove, the candles were dripping wax onto the pristine tablecloth, and the anniversary gift I'd wrapped so carefully, a custom architectural drawing of our dream vacation home in Tuscany, sat unopened beside his place setting. But none of that mattered anymore, because the look in Marcus's eyes told me that everything I'd been trying not to see was about to be impossible to ignore. "Can't it wait until after dinner?" I asked, my voice sounding strangely normal despite the way my world was starting to tilt on its axis. "I made your favorite, the lamb you love, and I opened that bottle of Bordeaux we've been saving." Marcus set the envelope down on the table, right next to the place card I'd handwritten with his name in elegant calligraphy, and shook his head. "I'm sorry, Victoria. I know how much work you put into this, and I know what today means to you, but I can't pretend anymore." Pretend. The word hit me like a physical blow, confirming every fear I'd been suppressing for months. How long had he been pretending? How long had our marriage been a performance for his benefit while I lived in blissful ignorance of how completely he'd checked out? Pretend what? I asked, though part of me already knew. Part of me had known for weeks, maybe months, but had chosen to focus on hotel renovations and staff meetings and anything else that would keep me from examining too closely the growing distance between us. Marcus loosened his tie, a gesture I'd seen him make thousands of times, but tonight it felt like he was removing the last pretense of being the husband I thought I knew. "Victoria, you're an incredible woman. You're brilliant and successful, and you deserve someone who can love you the way you should be loved." My legs felt weak, so I gripped the back of my chair, the dining chair we'd chosen together when we'd furnished this penthouse 5 years ago, when we'd talked about hosting dinner parties and holiday gatherings and growing old together in this beautiful space overlooking the city we both loved. "That someone isn't you anymore," I managed to ask, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended. "I've fallen in love with someone else," he said, and the words hung in the air like smoke poisoning everything they touched. "Her name is Cassandra, she's 28, and she's the landscape designer on the Napa project." I didn't plan for this to happen, Victoria. I fought it for months, but I can't deny what I feel for her anymore. 28. She was younger than the vintage of wine I'd opened for our anniversary dinner. She was probably closer in age to my nephew than to either of us. She was young enough to be the daughter we'd never had, young enough to believe in the kind of passionate, all-consuming love that Marcus and I had shared once upon a time, before mortgages and careers and the comfortable routine of long marriage had dulled the sharp edges of desire, into something steadier, but apparently less exciting. "How long?" I asked, because I needed to understand the scope of the betrayal, needed to know how many of our recent conversations had been lies, how many times he'd kissed me goodbye before going to her. 4 months, he said, and I did the math instantly. 4 months ago was June, when he'd started the Napa project, when he'd begun working longer hours and making more trips to the vineyard. 4 months ago was when he'd stopped reaching for me in the middle of the night, when he'd started showering immediately after coming home from work, when he'd begun keeping his phone face down on the nightstand. 4 months was long enough to fall in love, long enough to plan a future, long enough to make the decision to destroy the life we'd built together. "Are you leaving me for her?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the manila envelope and the careful way he'd chosen his words about deserving someone who could love me properly. "I've already moved most of my things to a temporary apartment," he said, and I realized I hadn't been paying attention to the details of our shared space, hadn't noticed the gradual disappearance of his presence from our home. "The papers in that envelope are a preliminary divorce agreement." I tried to be fair, Victoria. "You can keep the penthouse, and I'm not asking for any stake in your hotels. I just want to start over with Cassandra." Fair. As if there was anything fair about spending our 23rd wedding anniversary being told that I'd been replaced by someone who probably wasn't even born when we'd taken our vows. As if there was anything fair about him making unilateral decisions about our future while I'd been planning romantic dinners and buying anniversary gifts. I walked around the table and picked up the envelope, my hands surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. The papers were thick, expensive, prepared by a law firm whose name I recognized from the society pages. Marcus hadn't just fallen in love with someone else, he'd planned his exit strategy with the same methodical attention to detail he brought to his architectural projects. You had lawyers draw up divorce papers before you told your wife you wanted a divorce, I said, reading the first page and seeing my name, Victoria Sterling Blackwood, listed as the respondent in a proceeding I'd known nothing about until this moment. I wanted to make this as easy as possible for both of us, Marcus said, and the condescension in his voice sparked the first flame of anger in my chest. I know this is a shock, and I know you're hurt, but dragging this out won't help anyone. Cassandra and I want to start planning our future together. Planning their future. While I'd been planning anniversary dinners and dreaming about the Tuscan vacation home, he'd been planning a completely different life with someone else. While I'd been choosing the right wine and the perfect dress, he'd been choosing divorce lawyers and exit strategies. And you think I'm just going to sign these papers and disappear quietly so you can marry your girlfriend?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I asked, flipping through pages of legal language that reduced 23 years of marriage to assets and liabilities, to property divisions and spousal support calculations. I think you're too smart and too successful to waste time fighting something that's already over, Marcus said, and there was something in his tone that I'd never heard before. Dismissiveness. As if my feelings about the end of our marriage were an inconvenience he needed to manage rather than a devastating betrayal that deserved acknowledgement and respect. You think our marriage is over because you decided it's over. I think our marriage has been over for a long time, and we've both been going through the motions because it was easier than admitting we'd grown apart, Marcus said, and I realized he'd rewritten the history of our relationship to make his betrayal seem inevitable rather than chosen. Be honest, Victoria. When was the last time we really talked? When was the last time we made love? When was the last time either of us felt genuinely excited to come home to the other person? The questions stung because they contained fragments of truth. We had grown more distant over the past year. We had fallen into routines that prioritized efficiency over intimacy. We had stopped having the deep conversations that used to last until 3 in the morning, stopped surprising each other with spontaneous gestures of love, stopped prioritizing our relationship over our individual ambitions. But growing apart wasn't the same thing as being over. Distance could be bridged. Routines could be broken. Relationships could be renewed with effort and commitment, and the kind of love that doesn't give up when things get difficult. Marcus had chosen to give up. He'd chosen to find what was missing with someone else, instead of fighting to rebuild what we'd lost together. So you decided to find someone who would be excited to see you, I said, setting the papers back down on the table next to the cold dinner I'd prepared with such hope. Someone young enough to think you're as charming as you were 23 years ago. This isn't about age, Victoria. It's about connection. It's about finding someone who understands who I am now, not who I used to be. And I don't understand who you are now. Marcus looked around our dining room, at the evidence of the life we'd built together, the success we'd achieved, the comfort and security and status that our combined efforts had created. But when his eyes came back to mine, I saw pity there, and that was somehow worse than anger or guilt or even indifference. You understand the Marcus who wanted to build a successful practice and live in a beautiful penthouse and drive expensive cars, he said. But I'm not that person anymore. I want adventure. I want passion. I want to feel like every day is the beginning of something amazing instead of just another day in a life that's already been planned out. Adventure and passion with a 28-year-old landscape designer who probably found his success impressive and his attention flattering. Someone who didn't know him well enough to see his flaws, who hadn't lived through the years when he'd struggled to establish his practice, who hadn't supported him through the failures and disappointments that had shaped him into the man he'd become. Someone who made him feel young again, instead of reminding him that he was 47 years old, and had already made most of the major choices that would define his life. And Cassandra gives you that? I asked. Yes, he said simply. And the certainty in his voice was like a door slamming shut on everything we'd ever shared. She does. I stood there in my burgundy silk dress, surrounded by the ruins of what was supposed to be a romantic evening, and felt something shift inside my chest. The hurt was still there, sharp and overwhelming, but underneath it was growing something else. Something cooler and more calculating than the raw emotional pain of betrayal. Marcus thought this was going to be easy. He thought I would sign his papers and step aside gracefully, grateful for his generosity in letting me keep the penthouse and my business. He thought I was the kind of woman who would accept his decision without question, who would prioritize his happiness and his new relationship over my own sense of justice and self-respect. He thought wrong. I need time to process this, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I need time to review these papers with my own attorney. Marcus's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. Victoria, don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. I've been more than fair in the settlement terms. Fair according to who? According to you and your lawyer. According to what's convenient for your timeline with Cassandra. According to what makes sense for two adults who want to end their marriage civilly. Civil, as if there was anything civil about ambushing your spouse with divorce papers on your wedding anniversary. As if there was anything civilized about months of lies and secret phone calls and a double life that had made a mockery of every intimate moment we'd shared while he was falling in love with someone else. I'll have my attorney review the documents, I said again, picking up the envelope and tucking it under my arm. And then we'll see what fair actually looks like. Marcus straightened his shoulders, and I saw a flash of the controlling side of his personality that had emerged occasionally during our marriage, usually when things weren't going according to his carefully laid plans. Don't drag this out unnecessarily, Victoria. You have your business, your independence, your whole life ahead of you. Don't let bitterness turn you into someone you're not. Bitterness. As if wanting to protect myself legally was simply vindictiveness rather than common sense. As if expecting more than a few hours' notice before my husband destroyed our marriage was being unreasonable. And what kind of person am I, Marcus? In your opinion, you're someone who's always been practical and level-headed. Someone who understands that fighting battles you can't win just wastes everyone's time and energy. He was trying to manipulate me into compliance by appealing to my sense of pragmatism, painting any resistance to his plan as emotional hysteria rather than legitimate self-protection. It was a tactic I'd seen him use in business negotiations, and the fact that he was using it on me now, in this moment, told me everything I needed to know about how he really saw our marriage and our divorce. I'll be practical, I assured him. I'll be very, very practical. Something in my tone must have registered as potentially problematic because Marcus's expression became more guarded. What does that mean? It means I'm going to make sure I understand exactly what I'm agreeing to before I sign anything. It means I'm going to protect my interests the same way you've obviously been protecting yours. Victoria, don't turn this into a war. Think about what that would do to both our reputations, both our businesses. Our reputations, our businesses. He was worried about how a contentious divorce might affect his ability to build a new life with his girlfriend, worried about whether clients might lose respect for a man who'd abandoned his wife of 23 years for someone young enough to be his daughter. I'm not turning this into anything, I said. I'm simply refusing to be rushed into decisions that will affect the rest of my life, because you're eager to start your new one. Marcus picked up his briefcase and headed toward the door, and I realized he'd expected this conversation to end with my grateful acceptance of his generous terms and his immediate freedom to pursue his relationship openly. I'll be staying at the Fairmont until I find a more permanent place, he said. You can reach me there if you need to discuss anything. The Fairmont, our city's most expensive hotel, the place we'd spent our first anniversary, because we couldn't afford the penthouse suite but wanted to feel sophisticated and successful. Now he was staying there while he waited for his divorce to be finalized so he could start his new life with his young girlfriend. After he left, I stood alone in our dining room, surrounded by the evidence of the evening I'd planned so carefully. The lamb was ruined, the wine was getting warm, and the anniversary gift sat unopened beside his abandoned place setting. But instead of crying, instead of collapsing into the grief that was trying to overwhelm me, I did something that would have surprised Marcus if he'd still been there to see it. I smiled, because Marcus had made one crucial mistake in his carefully orchestrated plan to start over with his 28-year-old landscape designer. He'd assumed that I was the same woman he'd married 23 years ago, someone who would defer to his judgment and accept his decisions without question. He'd forgotten that I'd built 3 successful hotels from nothing, that I'd negotiated million-dollar deals with investors who'd tried to intimidate me, that I'd survived and thrived in an industry that ate weak people alive. He'd forgotten that practical and level-headed didn't mean passive and compliant, and he'd seriously underestimated what his fair divorce settlement was actually going to cost him. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Diana Rodriguez was the most ruthless divorce attorney in Seattle, a woman whose reputation for protecting her clients' interests was legendary in legal circles. I'd met her at several charity events, and we'd developed the kind of professional friendship that successful women in demanding fields often cultivate with each other. Diana answered on the second ring, despite the late hour. "Victoria, this is unexpected. What can I do for you?" "I need to schedule an emergency consultation," I said, looking down at the manila envelope that contained Marcus's version of our future. "My husband just served me with divorce papers on our anniversary, and I have a feeling his definition of fair and mine are going to be very different." Diana's laugh was sharp and knowing. "Men always think fair means they get to keep what they want and we get to be grateful for whatever's left over." "How soon can you be in my office? Is tomorrow morning too early?" "Tomorrow morning is perfect. And Victoria, bring everything. Bank statements, business records, property deeds, investment accounts, insurance policies, everything. If your husband thinks he can blindside you with a quickie divorce, he's about to learn exactly what practical and level-headed really looks like." After I hung up, I walked through our penthouse one more time, really seeing it for perhaps the first time in years. The artwork we'd chosen together, the furniture we'd selected, the view we'd fallen in love with, the home we'd created as a symbol of our success and partnership. Marcus thought he could walk away from all of this, start fresh with his young girlfriend, while I gracefully accepted the role of the discarded wife who'd served her purpose in his journey to success. He was about to discover that some battles are worth fighting, and some women are much more dangerous than they appear when you're only seeing what you want to see. The game was just beginning, and unlike Marcus, I'd never been in the habit of underestimating my opponents, especially when that opponent was myself. Diana Rodriguez's office occupied the 42nd floor of the Columbia Center, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. At 8:30 the next morning, I sat across from her massive mahogany desk, surrounded by bankers' boxes filled with 23 years of financial documents, business records, and evidence of the life Marcus thought he could simply walk away from. Diana was exactly what I'd expected from our previous encounters at charity galas and professional networking events. Impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe chignon and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She'd built her reputation on the ruins of men who'd underestimated their wives, and her track record in high-asset divorces was legendary throughout the Pacific Northwest legal community. She'd spent the past hour reviewing the preliminary divorce agreement Marcus had presented, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad with handwriting so precise it looked like calligraphy. Every few minutes, she would pause to ask me questions that revealed just how thoroughly she understood the complexities of dissolving a marriage between two successful professionals with significant assets and intertwined business interests. "Your husband's attorney is Gregory Manning," Diana said, setting down the divorce papers and fixing me with a look that was both sympathetic and calculating. "He's competent but not particularly creative, which suggests your husband thinks this is going to be straightforward. Manning specializes in quick, clean divorces for executives who want to minimize publicity and get on with their lives. And you think it won't be straightforward?" Diana's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Victoria, your husband has seriously miscalculated if he thinks he can present you with a fait accompli and expect you to simply acquiesce. Based on what you've told me and what I'm seeing in these documents, there are several significant issues with his proposed settlement." She opened a folder and pulled out a calculator, beginning to work through numbers with the kind of focused intensity I recognized from my own business negotiations. "First, let's talk about the hotels. According to his filing, he's claiming no interest in Sterling Hospitality Group, which suggests he either doesn't understand the full scope of your business, or he's hoping you won't realize what he's entitled to under Washington's community property laws." My stomach tightened. What is he entitled to? Potentially up to 50% of any increase in value that occurred during your marriage, depending on how the business was structured and whether marital funds were used for expansion or improvements. Diana pulled out another set of documents from her briefcase. I had my research team pull the incorporation papers and business filings for all 3 hotels last night. Sterling Hospitality Group was established in 2008, 7 years into your marriage. Yes, I started with the boutique hotel in Pioneer Square. The Belltown and Capitol Hill properties came later. And how were those acquisitions financed? I thought back to those early years of building my business empire, the careful planning and strategic investments that had transformed a single small hotel into a hospitality group worth millions. A combination of personal savings, business loans, and reinvested profits. Marcus and I used our joint savings account for the down payment on the Pioneer Square property. Diana made another note on her legal pad. Joint marital funds, which means your husband has a legitimate claim to a portion of your business empire, regardless of what his preliminary filing suggests. The question is whether he knows this, and is hoping you don't, or whether he genuinely doesn't understand the value of what he's walking away from. The possibility that Marcus might be entitled to half of everything I'd built made my chest tighten with a combination of rage and fear. I'd poured my heart and soul into those hotels, had worked 18-hour days for years to establish my reputation in the hospitality industry, had sacrificed time and energy and countless personal moments to build something that was uniquely mine. How much are we talking about? Diana consulted another document, and I could see her mental calculations as she processed the financial information I'd provided. Based on the current market valuations and the appreciation that's occurred since your marriage, we're looking at a potential claim of anywhere from $8 to $12 million. $12 million. The number hit me like a physical blow, not because I couldn't afford it, but because it represented Marcus's potential reward for betraying our marriage and abandoning me for a woman half his age. The idea that he could walk away with millions of dollars as compensation for his infidelity was so fundamentally unfair that it made my hands shake with suppressed fury. However, Diana continued, and something in her tone suggested that the conversation was about to take a more interesting turn. There are several factors that could significantly impact his claim. Tell me about the prenuptial agreement you signed before your wedding. We didn't have one. We were both just starting our careers, and neither of us had significant assets at the time. Interesting. And tell me about Marcus's architectural practice. When was it established, and how has it been financed over the years? I searched my memory for the details of Marcus's business development, the career progression that had paralleled my own journey in hospitality. He started Blackwood Design Associates in 2010, 2 years after I opened my first hotel. Initially, he worked from home, taking on small residential projects and some commercial renovations. And how did he finance the expansion of his practice? Office space, equipment, staff, marketing. The answer to that question had implications I was only beginning to understand. We used profits from the hotels to help establish his practice. I co-signed the lease on his first office space, and we used our joint business line of credit to purchase his computer equipment and design software. Diana's smile widened, and I could see her mind working through the legal possibilities that Marcus's attorney had apparently overlooked. So your hotel business helped finance the establishment and growth of his architectural practice, which means you may have a claim to a portion of his business assets as well. How significant a claim! Blackwood Design Associates has grown into one of the premier luxury resort design firms on the West Coast. Based on the client list and project portfolio I found online, and considering the fact that his recent Napa Valley project alone is probably worth several million in fees, we could be looking at a business valuation in the 15 to 20 million range. $20 million. Marcus's architectural practice, which I'd helped finance and support throughout our marriage, was worth potentially twice as much as what he thought he could claim from my hotels. The irony wasn't lost on me that while he was trying to walk away with half of what I'd built, he was apparently unaware that I might be entitled to half of what he'd built. Does he know this? Based on his preliminary filing, and the fact that he's claiming your hotels are separate property, while making no mention of protecting his own business assets, I'd say he has no idea what he's potentially exposed to. Diana leaned back in her chair, and I could see the predatory satisfaction in her expression. Your husband appears to have made the classic mistake of assuming that because he's the one initiating the divorce, he gets to control the terms. For the first time since Marcus had destroyed our anniversary dinner with his betrayal, I felt something other than hurt and rage. I felt hope, not hope for reconciliation, because that ship had sailed the moment he'd chosen his 28-year-old landscape designer over 23 years of marriage, but hope for justice. What do you recommend? Diana opened her laptop and began typing notes with the efficiency of someone who'd orchestrated dozens of similar campaigns. First, we're going to conduct a comprehensive valuation of both businesses, using forensic accountants who specialize in complex asset evaluation. Second, we're going to review every financial transaction that's occurred during your marriage to establish the extent to which marital funds were used to support both enterprises. She paused in her typing and fixed me with a look that was both conspiratorial and predatory. Third, we're going to investigate this Cassandra person and determine whether your husband used marital assets to finance his affair. Hotel stays, expensive dinners, gifts, travel expenses. If he spent your money courting his girlfriend, that's going to factor into our settlement calculations. The idea that Marcus might have used our joint accounts to wine and dine his replacement sent a fresh wave of anger through my system. Every romantic dinner he'd shared with Cassandra, every gift he'd bought her, every weekend getaway they'd enjoyed together would have been funded by the success of our partnership, the financial foundation we'd built together over more than 2 decades of marriage. How do we prove that? Credit card statements, bank records, expense reports from his business. If he charged romantic dinners to his corporate account and then deducted them as business expenses, that's tax fraud. If he used your joint credit cards to buy jewelry or flowers for another woman, that's misappropriation of marital assets. Diana pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts. I'm going to recommend a private investigator who specializes in marital misconduct cases. Someone who can document your husband's relationship with this landscape designer and establish a timeline for when the affair began and what it's cost financially. Is that necessary? He already admitted to the affair. Victoria admitting to adultery and providing a complete accounting of the resources he's invested in his mistress are 2 entirely different things. Men who are planning to leave their wives often start financially preparing for their exit months, or even years before they make their intentions known. They move money to accounts their spouses don't know about. They start building credit in their own names. They begin liquidating joint investments without consultation. The possibility that Marcus had been planning his escape for far longer than the 4 months he'd claimed made my stomach churn with a new kind of betrayal. You think he's been hiding money? I think he's a successful businessman who didn't wake up one morning and decide to spontaneously abandon his marriage for a woman he'd just met. 4 months is enough time to fall in love, but it's also enough time to move assets, establish separate accounts, and create financial independence. Diana turned her laptop screen toward me, showing a spreadsheet that she'd apparently been building while we talked. Look at this timeline. Your husband starts the Napa Valley project in June and meets Cassandra. But according to his bank statements, he opened a new personal checking account in March, 3 months before he claims the affair began. I studied the screen, seeing patterns in Marcus's financial behavior that I'd been too trusting to notice in real time. What does that mean? It means he was planning his exit strategy before he met his girlfriend, or he's lying about when the relationship actually started. Diana clicked to another screen, showing credit card statements with charges I didn't recognize. These charges to Tiffany & Company, to high-end restaurants in Napa Valley, to a luxury spa resort in Sonoma County. They all occurred over the past 6 months, but none of them involved you. 6 months. Marcus had been living a double life for half a year, using our shared resources to court another woman, while lying to my face about working late and being stressed about his career. Every business trip to Napa Valley had been an opportunity to build his relationship with Cassandra, while I stayed home managing my hotels and planning romantic anniversary dinners for a husband who was already emotionally divorced from our marriage. How much money are we talking about? Diana clicked through several more screens, tallying numbers with practiced efficiency. Based on what I can see in these preliminary records, at least $40,000 in questionable expenses over the past 6 months. Jewelry, flowers, expensive meals, weekend getaways, even what appears to be a down payment on a rental apartment in Napa Valley. $40,000 of our money spent on his girlfriend, while I'd been trying to save our marriage through romantic gestures and quality time together. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it took my breath away. Victoria, Diana said, and her voice had gentled slightly. I know this is overwhelming. I know you're processing the end of your marriage, while simultaneously discovering that your husband has been deceiving you on multiple levels, but I need you to understand something important. I looked up from the laptop screen, trying to focus on her words instead of the growing evidence of Marcus's systematic betrayal. You have significant leverage in this divorce that he doesn't expect you to use. His preliminary settlement offer suggests he thinks you're going to be grateful for his generosity and sign quickly to avoid a prolonged legal battle. He's counting on your desire to maintain your dignity and your reputation to prevent you from fighting for what you're actually entitled to. And what am I actually entitled to? Diana's smile was absolutely predatory now. Potentially half of his architectural practice, full ownership of your hotels, the penthouse, spousal support, and compensation for the marital assets he's misappropriated. We're talking about a settlement that could be worth $25 to $30 million instead of the $5 million he's proposing. $30 million. The number was staggering, not because I needed the money, but because it represented the true cost of Marcus's betrayal. He thought he could walk away from our marriage with his business intact, his reputation unscathed, and his freedom to start over with his young girlfriend. He had no idea that his decision to prioritize his midlife crisis over our partnership was about to cost him everything he'd worked to build. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Diana said, and something in her tone suggested that the most important part of our conversation was just beginning. Your husband's new girlfriend. Tell me everything you know about Cassandra. I realized I knew almost nothing about the woman who'd destroyed my marriage, except her age and profession. She's 28, she's a landscape designer, working on Marcus's Napa Valley project, and according to him, she makes him feel passionate and adventurous in ways I apparently don't anymore. Do you know her full name, where she lives, what company she works for? No. Marcus didn't exactly provide a detailed biography when he was explaining why he was leaving me for her. Diana made another note on her legal pad. We're going to find out everything there is to know about Cassandra. Her background, her financial situation, her relationship history, her professional reputation, if she's broken up other marriages, if she has a pattern of targeting successful older men, if she's financially motivated rather than genuinely in love, that's all going to be relevant to our case. How is her background relevant to my divorce settlement? Because if we can establish that your husband was targeted by a woman who specifically seeks out wealthy, married men, it changes the narrative from irreconcilable differences to husband was manipulated by a gold digger. That kind of narrative can influence everything from spousal support calculations to the division of assets. The idea that Cassandra might not be the innocent young woman who'd simply fallen in love with my husband was both comforting and infuriating. Comforting because it suggested that Marcus had been manipulated, rather than simply choosing to abandon our marriage, but infuriating because it meant I'd lost my husband to someone who might have been playing a calculated game from the beginning. You think she targeted him? I think 28-year-old landscape designers don't usually have access to the kind of wealthy established men who can afford to finance luxury lifestyles and expensive divorces. Your husband is successful, but he's not a celebrity or a tech billionaire. He's not the kind of man a young gold digger would encounter in her normal social circles, unless she was specifically positioning herself to meet wealthy, married architects. Diana pulled out her phone and began typing a text message. I'm contacting my investigator now. Within 48 hours, we'll know everything about Cassandra's background, her previous relationships, her financial situation, and most importantly, whether this is the first married man she's convinced to leave his wife. After our meeting ended, I drove back to the penthouse, through the familiar streets of downtown Seattle, seeing my city differently than I had just 24 hours earlier. The Space Needle looked the same, the waterfront was as beautiful as always, and Pike Place Market was bustling with its usual mix of tourists and locals. But I felt like I was seeing everything through new eyes, eyes that belonged to a woman who was no longer married, no longer part of the partnership that had defined her adult life. The penthouse felt different too, larger somehow, and eerily quiet, without the background noise of Marcus's presence. His coffee cup was no longer in the sink, his architectural magazines were no longer scattered across the dining room table, and his side of the closet was almost empty, except for a few shirts he'd apparently forgotten in his haste to move out. I walked through our home, really looking at it for the first time in years, seeing it not as the comfortable space we'd shared, but as evidence of what we'd built together, and what he was now trying to divide, according to his own self-serving calculations. The artwork we'd chosen together, on trips to galleries in New York and San Francisco. The furniture we'd selected when we'd moved in 5 years ago. The view we'd fallen in love with during our first tour of the building. Everything in this space represented decisions we'd made as partners, investments we'd made in our shared future, dreams we'd pursued together, before Marcus decided he wanted different dreams with a different partner. My phone rang, interrupting my melancholy tour of my own life. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway, hoping it might be Diana with an update on her investigation. Mrs. Blackwood, this is Jennifer Chen, from Pacific Northwest Business Journal. I'm calling because we've received some information about your husband's architectural firm, and I wanted to get your comment before we publish our story. My stomach dropped. What kind of story? We've learned that Marcus Blackwood is facing some significant financial irregularities related to his Napa Valley resort project. There are allegations that he's been billing the client for personal expenses, and that some of the project funds may have been misappropriated. I sat down heavily on the living room sofa, trying to process this new information. I'm sorry, but I don't know anything about my husband's business practices. You'd need to contact him directly. Mrs. Blackwood, our sources suggest that the financial irregularities may involve marital assets, and that you could be affected by any legal action the client decides to pursue. Are you aware that your husband has been using project funds to finance personal relationships? Personal relationships. The reporter was talking about Cassandra, about Marcus using client money to support his affair. The implications were staggering, not just for our divorce proceedings, but for Marcus's entire career and reputation. I have no comment, I said, ending the call before Jennifer Chen could ask any more questions that I wasn't prepared to answer. But as soon as I hung up, I called Diana's office. Her assistant put me through immediately, and I could hear the satisfaction in Diana's voice when I told her about the reporter's call. That was faster than I expected, Diana said. My investigator hasn't even started his formal research yet, but it sounds like other people have been asking questions about your husband's relationship with his landscape designer. What does this mean for our divorce?
It means your husband's situation just became significantly more complicated. If he's been using client funds to finance his affair, he's potentially facing criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. That changes everything about our negotiating position. I thought about Marcus sitting in his expensive hotel room, planning his future with Cassandra, probably unaware that his carefully orchestrated exit from our marriage was about to become a public scandal that could destroy his career and his reputation. Diana, I want to be very clear about something. I don't want to destroy Marcus's life out of spite or revenge, but I also won't be taken advantage of or dismissed as irrelevant to decisions about my own future. Understood? But Victoria, if your husband has been committing crimes to finance his affair, that's not your fault or your responsibility to cover up. That's a choice he made, and choices have consequences. After we hung up, I spent the rest of the afternoon going through Marcus's home office, looking for anything that might be relevant to Diana's investigation. His filing cabinets were mostly empty, his desk drawers had been cleared out, and his computer was password protected. But in the bottom drawer of his desk, hidden beneath some old tax returns, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a folder labeled Cassandra, filled with printed emails, photographs, and what appeared to be a business plan for something called Verda Landscape Design LLC. As I read through the documents, I realized that Marcus hadn't just been having an affair with his landscape designer, he'd been planning to go into business with her. The business plan was detailed and professional, outlining a luxury landscape design company that would specialize in high-end resort properties. Cassandra would handle the creative design work, while Marcus would provide the architectural expertise and the capital investment. According to the financial projections, Verda Landscape Design would require an initial investment of $2 million to establish operations, purchase equipment, and fund marketing efforts. $2 million that Marcus apparently planned to obtain through our divorce settlement. I photographed every document in the folder and sent them to Diana's secure email address, along with a message explaining what I'd found. Her response came back within minutes. "This changes everything. Your husband isn't just leaving you for another woman. He's been planning to use his divorce settlement to finance a new business venture with his mistress. We need to meet first thing tomorrow morning." As evening fell over Seattle, I stood on the balcony of the penthouse, looking out at the city lights and the dark waters of Elliott Bay. 24 hours ago, I'd been a wife preparing an anniversary dinner for her husband of 23 years. Tonight I was a woman discovering the true scope of the betrayal that had ended her marriage. Marcus thought he'd been clever, planning his exit strategy and his new business venture while I remained obliviously focused on saving our relationship. He thought he could present me with a fait accompli and expect me to gracefully accept his version of a fair settlement. But Marcus had made one crucial error in his calculations. He'd forgotten that I'd built my own business empire from nothing, that I'd survived and thrived in an industry that demanded intelligence, strategy, and the ability to outmaneuver opponents who underestimated me. He was about to learn that some women are much more dangerous than they appear when you're only seeing what you want to see. The war for my future was just beginning, and unlike Marcus, I'd never been in the habit of underestimating my opponents. Especially when that opponent was myself. The confrontation Diana had orchestrated was scheduled for Thursday morning at 10 o'clock in the conference room of Manning Sterling & Associates, Marcus's attorney's firm. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in my most expensive business suit, a midnight blue Armani that I'd worn to close the deal on my Capitol Hill hotel 3 years ago. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. This wasn't just about dividing assets or negotiating settlements. This was about reclaiming the power and respect that Marcus thought he could strip away with his betrayal. Diana met me in the building's marble lobby, carrying 2 briefcases and wearing the kind of predatory smile that had made her reputation in Seattle's legal community. She was accompanied by James Morrison, the forensic accountant she'd hired to analyze both businesses, and Detective Patricia Walsh from the Seattle Police Department's white-collar crime unit. "Detective Walsh is here at the request of Marcus's client," Diana explained as we rode the elevator to the 38th floor. "It seems the Napa Valley Resort developers have filed a formal complaint about misappropriated funds, and the district attorney's office is considering criminal charges." The elevator doors opened to reveal an opulent law firm lobby with Persian rugs, oil paintings, and the kind of understated luxury that screamed old money and established power. Gregory Manning's firm had been representing Seattle's elite for over 50 years, and everything about the space was designed to intimidate and impress. But I'd negotiated million-dollar hotel acquisitions in boardrooms just as impressive as this one, and I'd learned long ago that expensive surroundings were often used to mask weak negotiating positions. We were escorted to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Sound, where Marcus was already seated beside his attorney. He looked older than he had just 6 days ago, with new lines around his eyes and a tension in his posture that suggested his carefully planned exit from our marriage wasn't going as smoothly as he'd expected. Gregory Manning was exactly what I'd anticipated from Diana's description, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of representing wealthy clients in complicated divorces. But when he stood to greet us, I noticed a wariness in his expression that suggested he'd already been briefed on some uncomfortable developments in his client's case. "Mrs. Blackwood," Manning said, extending his hand with professional courtesy. "I understand you've had time to review the settlement proposal. I'm hoping we can reach an amicable agreement today that serves everyone's interests." "That depends on what you consider everyone's interests," Diana replied before I could speak. "My client's interests include full disclosure of all marital assets, proper valuation of both businesses, and accountability for funds that have been misappropriated during the marriage." Marcus's face went pale at the word misappropriated, and I saw him glance nervously at Detective Walsh, who had taken a seat at the far end of the conference table with a thick folder and a digital recorder. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Manning said, but his tone had lost some of its initial confidence. My client has been completely transparent about his assets and has proposed a generous settlement that allows Mrs. Blackwood to retain full ownership of her hotel business. Diana opened her first briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents that she arranged on the table with theatrical precision. Let's discuss transparency, shall we? Morrison, would you please share your findings about the financial relationship between Blackwood Design Associates and Sterling Hospitality Group? James Morrison was a thin, precise man who spoke with the kind of methodical clarity that made complex financial information accessible to laypeople. He opened his laptop and turned the screen toward Manning and Marcus, displaying a series of charts and graphs that told the story of our intertwined financial lives. Over the course of the Blackwoods' marriage, Sterling Hospitality Group provided approximately $4.3 million in direct and indirect support to Blackwood Design Associates. Morrison began. This includes the initial capital investment to establish the firm, ongoing financial support during lean periods, loan guarantees, and shared resources, such as office equipment and administrative support. $4.3 million. The number hung in the air like an accusation, and I watched Marcus's expression shift from confusion to dawning horror as he realized the implications of what Morrison was saying. Furthermore, Morrison continued, Blackwood Design Associates has been structured as a sole proprietorship rather than a corporation, which means that under Washington state community property law, Mrs. Blackwood is entitled to 50% ownership of the business and all its assets. Manning was taking rapid notes on a yellow legal pad, and I could see him recalculating his strategy in real time. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that Mrs. Blackwood has an ownership stake in my client's architectural firm? I'm not suggesting it, Morrison replied. I'm stating it as a legal fact. The business was established during the marriage using marital funds, and it has been supported throughout its existence by income from Mrs. Blackwood's hotels. Under community property law, she owns half of everything Mr. Blackwood has built. Diana pulled out another set of documents and slid them across the table to Manning. This is our preliminary valuation of Blackwood Design Associates, based on current client contracts, projected revenues, and the firm's reputation in the luxury resort market. We're looking at a business worth approximately $18 million. $18 million. Marcus's architectural firm, which he'd apparently assumed was his separate property to do with as he pleased, was worth nearly twice what he'd estimated in his original settlement proposal. And according to Morrison's analysis, I owned half of it. There must be some mistake, Marcus said, speaking for the first time since we'd entered the room. His voice was hoarse, strained, nothing like the confident tone he'd used when he'd announced his intention to divorce me. I built that firm myself. Victoria had nothing to do with the day-to-day operations. Day-to-day operations are irrelevant to ownership under community property law, Diana replied. What matters is that your firm was established and supported using marital assets. Your wife's hotels provided the financial foundation that allowed you to take the creative risks and pursue the high-end clients that made your firm successful. Detective Walsh cleared her throat and opened her folder, drawing everyone's attention to the far end of the table. I'm afraid we have more pressing concerns than asset division to discuss. Mr. Blackwood, are you familiar with the Vintners Ridge Resort project in Napa Valley? Marcus's face went completely white. Of course, that's my current major project. And are you familiar with Verda Landscape Design LLC, a company that was incorporated 3 months ago with you listed as the registered agent and primary investor? The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Marcus struggle to find words while Manning frantically shuffled through his files, clearly hearing about Verda Landscape Design for the first time. Detective Walsh, Manning said, my client hasn't been informed of any criminal investigation. If you're suggesting, I'm not suggesting anything. Detective Walsh interrupted. I'm informing you that Mr. Blackwood is being investigated for embezzlement fraud and the misappropriation of client funds. The developers of Vintners Ridge Resort have provided evidence that over $600,000 in project funds were diverted to personal accounts and used for purposes unrelated to the resort construction. $600,000. The sum was staggering, far more than the $40,000 Diana had initially estimated based on credit card statements and obvious personal expenses. Marcus hadn't just been using our money to court his mistress, he'd been stealing from his clients to finance an entirely new life. That's impossible, Marcus stammered. I would never. The expenses were all legitimate business costs: travel, client entertainment, consultation fees. Detective Walsh pulled a thick folder from her briefcase and opened it to reveal bank statements, receipts, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs. Mr. Blackwood, we have documentation of transfers from the Vintners Ridge construction account to Verda Landscape Design, which is owned by your girlfriend, Cassandra Moreau. We also have records of personal expenses charged to the project account, including jewelry purchases, spa treatments, and a down payment on a luxury apartment in Napa Valley. She spread several photographs across the conference table, images that showed Marcus and a young blonde woman at expensive restaurants, holding hands while walking through vineyard landscapes, and embracing outside what appeared to be a real estate office. These photographs were taken by a private investigator, hired by the Vintners Ridge developers, when they became suspicious about cost overruns and unexplained expenses. As you can see, they clearly show you in intimate situations with Miss Moreau at times when you were supposedly conducting business meetings related to the resort project. I stared at the photographs, seeing my husband's betrayal documented in vivid detail. The way he looked at Cassandra, the obvious intimacy between them, the expensive clothes and jewelry she wore that had apparently been purchased with stolen client funds. This wasn't just an affair. This was a criminal enterprise designed to strip assets from his clients and his wife to finance a new life with his mistress. Manning was frantically taking notes, and I could see him trying to calculate damage control strategies for a client whose situation had just become exponentially more complicated. Detective Walsh, if my client is facing criminal charges, we need to suspend these divorce proceedings until the criminal matters are resolved. Actually, Diana said, and her smile was absolutely predatory. The criminal charges make our civil case much stronger. Mr. Blackwood's theft of client funds demonstrates a pattern of financial deception that goes well beyond his betrayal of his marriage. It shows systematic fraud, designed to strip assets from multiple sources, to finance his relationship with Miss Moreau. She pulled out yet another folder, and I marveled at how thoroughly she'd prepared for this confrontation. We've also completed our investigation into Miss Moreau's background, and the results are quite illuminating. James, would you please share what we discovered about Mr. Blackwood's girlfriend? Morrison consulted his laptop and pulled up a new screen that showed what appeared to be a detailed background report. Cassandra Moreau, age 28, has been married twice previously, both times to men over 50 who were significantly wealthier than her. Her first husband died in a skiing accident 18 months after their wedding, leaving her a substantial inheritance. Her second husband divorced her when he discovered she was having an affair with his business partner. The pattern was becoming clear, and I could see recognition dawning in Marcus's eyes as he realized he'd been played by a woman who apparently specialized in targeting successful older men. Furthermore, Morrison continued, Miss Moreau has never held a legitimate position as a landscape designer. She has no formal training, no professional certifications, and no previous clients outside of the men she's been romantically involved with. She appears to be a professional manipulator who creates fake credentials to gain access to wealthy targets. Marcus looked like he was going to be physically sick. The woman he'd abandoned his marriage for, the woman he'd stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars to support, the woman he'd planned to build a new business with, was essentially a criminal who had targeted him specifically for his wealth and vulnerability. That's not possible, Marcus said weakly. Cassandra is brilliant. She has innovative ideas about sustainable landscaping. She understands design principles better than anyone I've worked with. Detective Walsh pulled out another photograph, this one showing Cassandra with a different man, significantly older than Marcus, standing in front of what appeared to be a luxury yacht. This is Miss Moreau, with her second husband, taken 3 months before she filed for divorce, and 1 week before she started her affair with his business partner. Does this look like someone who's interested in sustainable landscaping, or someone who's interested in wealthy men's bank accounts? The devastation on Marcus's face was almost painful to watch. In the space of 30 minutes, his carefully constructed new life had collapsed entirely. The woman he thought he loved was a fraud. The business venture he'd planned was based on lies. The client funds he'd stolen would have to be repaid. And the wife he'd thought he could manipulate into accepting an unfavorable settlement was revealing herself to be far more formidable than he'd ever imagined.
Diana stood up and walked to the windows, looking out at the city skyline with the satisfaction of someone who had just delivered a knockout blow. Here's where we stand, Mr. Manning. Your client is facing criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. He's been systematically deceived by a woman who appears to have targeted him specifically for financial exploitation. And he's about to lose half of everything he's built to the wife he betrayed, and attempted to cheat out of her rightful share of their marital assets. She turned back to face the table, and her expression was all business now. We're prepared to be reasonable, but our definition of reasonable is very different from your client's original proposal. Mrs. Blackwood will retain full ownership of Sterling Hospitality Group. She will receive 50% ownership of Blackwood Design Associates. She will keep the penthouse and all personal property acquired during the marriage. And Mr. Blackwood will be responsible for any criminal restitution required as a result of his theft of client funds. Manning was calculating frantically, and I could see him trying to find some angle that would salvage something for his client. Miss Rodriguez, if your client takes 50% ownership of Blackwood Design Associates, she'll be inheriting 50% of the criminal liability as well. The Vintners Ridge developers could pursue civil action against the firm for the return of misappropriated funds. Actually, Diana replied, we've already spoken with the developers' attorneys. They're prepared to pursue restitution exclusively from Mr. Blackwood personally, rather than from the firm, in exchange for Mrs. Blackwood's cooperation in documenting the full extent of his financial deception. It was a masterful legal strategy. The developers got their money back. I got protection from liability for Marcus's crimes, and Marcus got to face the full consequences of his betrayal, without being able to hide behind corporate structures or shared responsibility. There's one more thing, Detective Walsh added, and something in her tone suggested that the worst revelations were yet to come. Mr. Blackwood, are you aware that Miss Moreau has been in contact with several of your other clients over the past month, offering landscape design services for their properties? Marcus's confusion was evident. That's impossible. Cassandra doesn't know my other clients. She knows them because she's been accessing your client files and contact information without authorization. We have evidence that she's been using her relationship with you to gain access to confidential business information, which she's then used to solicit work independently. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Cassandra hadn't just been using Marcus for his money and his connections. She'd been systematically stealing his client base to build her own fraudulent business empire. The woman he'd thought loved him had been planning to destroy his professional reputation while enriching herself at his expense. She's been stealing my clients, Marcus asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. She's been attempting to, Detective Walsh confirmed.
Fortunately, most of your clients were suspicious of unsolicited contact from an unknown landscape designer, and several of them contacted your office to verify whether she was legitimately associated with your firm. Diana sat back down and opened her second briefcase, pulling out a final set of documents that she placed in front of Manning. This is our revised settlement proposal. Mr. Blackwood signs over 50% ownership of his firm to Mrs. Blackwood, accepts full personal responsibility for restitution of stolen client funds, vacates the penthouse immediately, and waives any claim to spousal support or shared custody of personal property. She paused and fixed Marcus with a look that was both pitying and stern. In exchange, Mrs. Blackwood agrees not to pursue additional civil action for the emotional distress and reputational damage caused by his infidelity and criminal behavior. She also agrees to allow him to retain operational control of Blackwood Design Associates, assuming he can avoid prison and maintain his professional license. The offer was generous, far more generous than Marcus deserved, given the scope of his betrayal and criminal behavior. But it was also strategically brilliant, because it gave him a path to rebuild his life while ensuring that I received everything I was legally entitled to, plus protection from the consequences of his crimes. Manning spent several minutes reviewing the documents, occasionally whispering with Marcus, who looked like he was aging years with each revelation about his girlfriend's true nature and the extent of his legal exposure. My client needs time to consider this proposal, Manning finally said. Your client has until close of business today, Diana replied. After that, we withdraw the offer and pursue full criminal and civil action. The district attorney's office is prepared to file formal charges tomorrow morning if Mr. Blackwood doesn't cooperate with restitution efforts. Detective Walsh closed her folder and stood up. Mr. Blackwood, I strongly recommend that you accept this settlement offer. Your situation is only going to get worse if you try to fight it. Miss Moreau has already fled the state, and we have reason to believe she's been in contact with federal authorities about providing testimony against you in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The final betrayal. Cassandra had not only used Marcus and stolen from his clients, but she was now apparently prepared to testify against him to save herself from criminal charges. The woman he'd destroyed his marriage for was going to be the witness who sent him to prison. After Detective Walsh left, the conference room felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of Marcus's collapsed world was pressing down on all of us. He sat with his head in his hands, and for a moment I felt a flicker of sympathy for the man who had been my husband for 23 years. But the sympathy passed quickly, replaced by a cold satisfaction that justice was finally being served. Marcus, I said, speaking directly to him for the first time since the meeting began. You have a choice to make. You can accept Diana's settlement offer and try to rebuild your life with some dignity intact, or you can fight this and lose everything anyway while facing criminal prosecution. He looked up at me, and I saw tears in his eyes for the first time since I'd known him. Victoria, I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I loved her. I thought she loved me. You thought a lot of things that turned out to be wrong, I replied. But thinking isn't the same as knowing, and wanting isn't the same as deserving. You made choices, Marcus. You chose to lie to me, to steal from your clients, and to trust someone who was playing you from the beginning. Manning was still reviewing the settlement documents, but I could see from his expression that he was going to recommend acceptance. There was simply no viable alternative for his client given the criminal exposure and the overwhelming evidence of financial misconduct. Miss Rodriguez, Manning said finally, assuming my client accepts this settlement, what assurances do we have that Mrs. Blackwood won't pursue additional civil action in the future? You have my word, I said before Diana could answer. If Marcus signs those papers and makes full restitution to his victims, I'll consider our marriage officially over and our business concluded. But if he tries to hide assets, if he fails to cooperate with the criminal investigation, or if I discover additional deception that hasn't been disclosed, all bets are off. Marcus signed the settlement agreement at 4:30 that afternoon, after spending most of the day in hushed conferences with his attorney and several increasingly desperate phone calls to colleagues who might be able to help him raise the funds for criminal restitution. I watched him sign away half of everything he'd built, accept responsibility for his crimes, and formally dissolve our 23-year marriage, and I felt nothing but relief. Not satisfaction, not revenge, not even the closure I'd thought I would need. Just relief that it was finally over. Diana walked me to my car after the settlement was finalized, both of us carrying copies of the signed agreements that would reshape the rest of my life. How do you feel? She asked, as we stood in the parking garage beneath Manning's office building. Free, I said, and I realized it was the truth. For the first time in months, maybe years, I feel completely free. What are you going to do now? I thought about the question as I got into my car, contemplating the future that stretched ahead of me. I was 45 years old, financially independent, and no longer bound by the compromises and accommodations that had defined my marriage. I owned 3 successful hotels and half of a prestigious architectural firm. I had a penthouse overlooking one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and enough money to travel anywhere I wanted to go. Most importantly, I had my self-respect back. 3 months later, I stood in the lobby of my newest acquisition, a boutique hotel in downtown Portland that I'd purchased with the proceeds from selling my stake in Blackwood Design Associates back to Marcus. He'd managed to avoid prison by making full restitution to his victims and agreeing to extensive community service, but his reputation in the luxury resort market had been destroyed by the scandal. The Portland hotel was smaller than my Seattle properties, but had enormous potential for growth in the Pacific Northwest's expanding tourism market. I'd already begun planning renovations that would transform it into the kind of intimate, sophisticated destination that attracted travelers who valued unique experiences over generic luxury. My phone buzzed with a text message from Diana, who had become a friend as well as my attorney over the months of legal proceedings. Saw the article in Business Weekly about your Portland expansion, drinks to celebrate.
The Business Weekly article had been a profile of successful women entrepreneurs in the hospitality industry, featuring a photograph of me in my new hotel's lobby and a quote about the importance of resilience in business and in life. The reporter had asked about my divorce, but I'd declined to discuss details, simply saying that sometimes major life changes create opportunities for personal and professional growth. I was arranging flowers in the hotel's main reception area when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Victoria," I turned to see Harold Morrison, my oldest client from my early days in the hotel business, standing in the lobby with a woman I didn't recognize. "What are you doing in Portland?" "Meeting with my daughter about opening a satellite office down here," he said, gesturing to the younger woman beside him. "This is Rachel, she's been handling our West Coast expansion plans." Rachel Morrison was probably in her 30s, with her father's sharp eyes and confident handshake. "Miss Sterling, I've heard so much about you from my father. He says you were his inspiration for getting into commercial real estate." We chatted for a few minutes about their expansion plans and my new hotel, and Harold mentioned that he'd heard about my divorce through mutual business contacts. "I'm sorry about what happened with Marcus," he said as they prepared to leave. "But if I'm being honest, I always thought you were the real visionary in that relationship. He was good at the technical stuff, but you understood people and what they really wanted." After they left, I continued working on the flower arrangements, thinking about Harold's comment and about the journey that had brought me to this point. 6 months ago, I'd been a woman preparing anniversary dinners for a husband who was already planning to leave me. Tonight, I was a successful businesswoman building an empire on my own terms, making decisions based on my own judgment and priorities. My phone rang, and I glanced at the caller ID, expecting to see Diana's number, or perhaps one of my hotel managers with a question about operations. Instead, I saw a number I didn't recognize with a Seattle area code. "Victoria Sterling," I answered, using my maiden name for the first time in over 2 decades. "Miss Sterling, this is Jennifer Walsh from Walsh & Associates Architecture. I'm calling because I have a client who's interested in your hotels as a possible venue for a destination wedding, and they specifically requested to work with someone who understands luxury hospitality from both the business and design perspectives." Walsh & Associates. I'd never heard of the firm, but the name Walsh was familiar for some reason I couldn't quite place. "I'd be happy to discuss your client's needs," I said. "What kind of event are they planning?" "A 3-day wedding celebration for about 200 guests. They want something intimate but sophisticated, with custom design elements that reflect their personal style. They're willing to pay premium rates for the right venue and the right team." We talked for another 10 minutes about the client's requirements and my hotel's capabilities, and Jennifer Walsh impressed me with her understanding of both the hospitality and design aspects of luxury event planning. "Walsh, forgive me for asking, but are you related to Detective Patricia Walsh?" "The name sounds familiar." Jennifer laughed. "She's my sister. She mentioned that she'd worked with you on a case a few months ago, and said you were one of the most professionally impressive people she'd ever met." Detective Walsh had been impressed with my professionalism during Marcus's criminal case. The irony wasn't lost on me that her sister was now calling to offer me business opportunities that would have been impossible if I'd remained trapped in my marriage to a man who'd seen me as secondary to his own ambitions. "I'd love to meet with your client and discuss their vision," I said. "Why don't you come by the hotel tomorrow afternoon, and we can talk about how to make their celebration everything they're dreaming of." After I hung up, I walked through my new hotel, checking on renovation progress, and imagining the kinds of events and experiences I could create in this beautiful space. The Portland property was smaller than my Seattle hotels, but it had character and potential that excited me in ways I hadn't felt in years. My reflection caught my eye in one of the lobby mirrors, and I paused to really look at myself for the first time in months. The woman looking back at me was confident, successful, and completely in control of her own destiny. She was someone who had survived betrayal and emerged stronger, someone who had refused to accept other people's definitions of what her life should look like. She was someone I was proud to be. That evening, I had dinner alone in my hotel's restaurant, reviewing architectural plans for the renovation and making notes about staffing needs and marketing strategies. The solitude that had felt so overwhelming in the weeks after Marcus left now felt peaceful and productive.
I was building something that was entirely mine, making decisions based on my own vision and values, rather than trying to compromise with someone whose priorities were fundamentally different from my own. My phone buzzed with another text message, this one from Marcus. Victoria, I know I have no right to contact you, but I wanted you to know that I'm starting therapy and I'm committed to understanding how I became someone I don't recognize. I hope someday you can forgive me, not for my sake, but for yours. I read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. Forgiveness might come eventually, but it wouldn't be motivated by his need for absolution or my need for closure. If forgiveness came, it would be because I chose to let go of anger that no longer served any purpose in my life. But that decision was for another day. Tonight I was focused on building the future I wanted, rather than processing the past I couldn't change. I finished my dinner and my planning session, then walked through the hotel one more time before heading home to my penthouse. The space felt different now, larger and more peaceful without the weight of a failing marriage pressing down on every interaction. I'd redecorated Marcus's former office as a home gym, turned his side of the walk-in closet into an expanded workspace, and replaced his personal photos with artwork I'd been wanting to display for years. The penthouse had become truly mine in ways it had never been during our marriage, reflecting my taste and priorities, rather than compromises between two different visions of what our home should be. As I got ready for bed, I thought about the article I'd read that morning about successful women who had reinvented themselves after major life changes. The women profiled had all faced different challenges: divorce, career setbacks, health crises, financial difficulties, but they'd all shared a common determination to refuse victimhood and create new definitions of success on their own terms. I was becoming one of those women, someone who had transformed the worst experience of her life into the foundation for something better and stronger than what had come before. The betrayal that had ended my marriage had also freed me to discover capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed, to pursue dreams I'd deferred for the sake of partnership, and to build a life that was authentically mine, rather than a compromise between competing visions. Marcus had given me many things during our 23 years together: love, companionship, shared adventures, and the financial foundation that had enabled my business success. But the gift he'd given me by leaving, though he'd never intended it as such, was the opportunity to discover who I was when I wasn't defined by someone else's needs and expectations. I was Victoria Sterling, successful entrepreneur, strategic thinker, and survivor of betrayal who had emerged stronger rather than broken. And I was just getting started. 2 years had passed since the conference room confrontation that had redefined my entire existence, and I found myself standing in the ballroom of my newest acquisition, a historic mansion in Carmel by the Sea that I'd transformed into the most exclusive boutique hotel on the California coast. The Sterling Collection, as my hotel group was now known, had expanded to 6 properties across 3 states, each one carefully selected for its unique character and potential for creating unforgettable experiences. Tonight was the grand opening celebration for Ocean View Manor, and the guest list read like a who's who of West Coast society. Tech entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley mingled with winemakers from Napa, while celebrities from Los Angeles chatted with politicians from Sacramento. The event had been featured in Architectural Digest and Town & Country, cementing my reputation as one of the premier luxury hospitality designers in the country. I wore a custom-designed emerald green gown that complemented the mansion's restored Victorian elegance, my dark hair swept up in an elaborate chignon, secured with vintage diamond pins that had belonged to the mansion's original owner. The irony wasn't lost on me that I looked more confident and radiant at 47 than I had at 45, when I'd still been trying to save a marriage that was already over. The transformation hadn't been easy. Those first months after the divorce had been filled with sleepless nights, anxiety attacks, and moments of crushing loneliness that made me question whether I'd made the right choice in fighting for what was mine, rather than accepting Marcus's original settlement offer. But gradually, as I'd thrown myself into expanding my business empire and discovering who I was outside the context of marriage, I'd found a strength and purpose that surprised even me. "Victoria Sterling, you've outdone yourself," said a familiar voice behind me. I turned to see Catherine Williams, the editor of Pacific Coast Lifestyle magazine, approaching with a photographer in tow. Catherine had become something of a friend over the past year, featuring my hotels in several high-profile articles that had attracted international attention to my work. Catherine, thank you for being here. I hope you're getting everything you need for the article. More than enough, this place is absolutely magical. The way you've preserved the historical integrity, while adding modern luxury touches, is extraordinary. Catherine gestured toward the photographer, who began capturing candid shots of the elegant crowd, enjoying cocktails and conversation in the meticulously restored space. It's all about respecting the past, while embracing the future, I said, a philosophy that had guided not just my business decisions, but my personal recovery as well. This mansion has incredible stories to tell, and my job is to create an environment where new stories can be written alongside the old ones. As we talked, I noticed a commotion near the main entrance, where my event coordinator was speaking urgently with one of the security guards. Excusing myself from Catherine, I made my way through the crowd to investigate what appeared to be an uninvited guest situation. Miss Sterling, my coordinator said, as I approached, there's someone here who claims to know you personally, but his name isn't on the guest list. He says it's important that he speak with you. Through the ornate glass doors, I could see a figure standing in the circular driveway, partially obscured by shadows and the vintage lampposts that illuminated the mansion's entrance. Something about his posture seemed familiar, and my stomach tightened with an inexplicable sense of dread. Did he give you his name, Marcus Blackwood? He says he's your former husband. The name hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting this moment for months. Marcus had been calling and texting sporadically since his legal troubles had been resolved, always claiming he needed to see me, always insisting there were things about our divorce that I didn't understand. I'd ignored every attempt at contact, but somehow I'd known he would eventually show up at one of my events, probably hoping the public setting would prevent me from having him removed. Tell him I'm not available, and ask security to escort him off the property, I said, my voice steady despite the way my heart was racing. Actually, Miss Sterling, there's something else. He's not alone, there's a woman with him, and she appears to be quite pregnant. Pregnant. The word sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze drifting through the mansion's open windows. I walked to the glass doors and looked out at the driveway, where Marcus stood beside a young woman, with long blonde hair and an unmistakably rounded belly beneath her cocktail dress. It wasn't Cassandra. This was someone else entirely. Someone who looked even younger than Marcus's criminal ex-girlfriend. Someone who was obviously carrying his child. Give me 5 minutes, I told my coordinator. Then if I haven't returned, call security and have them both removed. I stepped onto the mansion's wraparound porch, feeling the cool evening air against my skin and hearing the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocky coastline below. Marcus looked older than I remembered, with more gray in his hair and deeper lines around his eyes. The woman beside him was probably in her early 20s, with the kind of fresh-faced beauty that would fade quickly under the stress of being involved with a man who had proven himself capable of spectacular self-destruction. Victoria, Marcus said, stepping forward with a nervous smile. You look incredible. Success obviously agrees with you. What do you want, Marcus? And why did you bring a pregnant stranger to my business event? This is Emma, he said, placing a protective hand on the young woman's shoulder. We're getting married next month, and we wanted to tell you in person. Emma, she looked like she belonged in a college sorority rather than planning a wedding to a 49-year-old man with a criminal record and a destroyed professional reputation. But there was something in her eyes that reminded me of myself at that age, a combination of determination and naivety that suggested she believed love could conquer any obstacle. Congratulations, I said, meaning it despite the complicated emotions swirling through my chest. But I still don't understand why you're here.
Marcus glanced around at the elegant mansion, the beautifully dressed guests visible through the windows, the obvious success that surrounded every aspect of my new life. I wanted to apologize, not just for the divorce, but for everything that came after. The way I tried to minimize your contributions to our marriage, the way I attempted to cheat you out of what you deserved, the way I let my own selfishness blind me to who you really were. You apologized in your texts, multiple times. I told you through my attorney that I wasn't interested in having this conversation. I know, but I needed to see you face to face. I needed you to know that I understand now what I lost when I chose to betray our marriage. Marcus's voice cracked slightly, and I could see genuine remorse in his expression. Emma's pregnancy has made me realize how much damage I did, not just to you but to the possibility of us ever having the family we talked about when we were young. The family we'd never had. It was a wound that had never fully healed, even during the worst moments of our divorce proceedings. We'd tried for years to conceive, had endured multiple rounds of fertility treatments, had finally accepted that children might not be part of our story together. And now Marcus was starting the family we'd dreamed of with someone young enough to be our daughter. Marcus, I'm happy for you. I genuinely hope you've learned from your mistakes and that you'll be a better husband to Emma than you were to me. But your personal growth isn't my responsibility anymore, and your guilt isn't my problem to solve. Emma stepped forward, and I could see she was nervous but determined to speak her piece. Sterling, I wanted to meet you because Marcus has told me so much about your marriage and about the mistakes he made. I want you to know that I don't expect you to forgive him, but I hope you can understand that he's changed. There was something touching about her earnestness, her obvious belief that love and good intentions could heal the damage that Marcus had inflicted on multiple lives. I remembered being that young, that certain that I could help the right man become the best version of himself through patience and devotion. Emma, how old are you? 23, she said, lifting her chin defiantly, as if she'd been expecting the question and had prepared herself to defend her choices. 23. The same age I'd been when Marcus and I had gotten married, full of dreams and determination and absolute certainty that we were building something that would last forever. The symmetry was both heartbreaking and oddly appropriate. And how did you two meet? Marcus answered before Emma could speak. She was waitressing at a restaurant near my new office. I was there almost every day for lunch, trying to rebuild my practice after everything that happened. She was kind to me when most people in the industry wouldn't even return my phone calls. A waitress who'd been kind to a disgraced architect eating lunch alone every day. It was exactly the kind of meet-cute story that would appeal to a young woman who believed in redemption and second chances. Marcus had always been charming when he wanted to be, and a 23-year-old waitress would have seen his attention as romantic rather than recognizing the pattern of behavior that had destroyed his previous marriage. Emma, I said gently, I hope Marcus has been completely honest with you about his criminal record and the reasons our marriage ended. He's told me everything, she said quickly, but something in her tone suggested that Marcus's version of everything might have been carefully edited to minimize his culpability. He made mistakes, but he's paid for them. Everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone deserves a second chance. It was exactly what I would have said at 23, before I'd learned that some mistakes reveal fundamental character flaws rather than temporary lapses in judgment. But Emma would have to learn that lesson on her own, just as I had. Well, I said, checking my watch and seeing that my 5 minutes were nearly up, I hope you'll both be very happy together. Marcus, I wish you success in rebuilding your career and your reputation. Emma, I wish you wisdom as you navigate the challenges ahead. I turned to go back inside, but Marcus called my name before I could reach the door. Victoria, there's one more thing. I know you probably won't believe this, but seeing what you've accomplished since our divorce, the hotels, the recognition, the success you've built entirely on your own terms, it's made me realize that I was holding you back. You're flourishing in ways you never could have while you were married to me. The observation was more perceptive than I'd expected from a man who had proven himself capable of spectacular self-deception. And it was probably true. The drive and creativity that had built the Sterling collection had been there during our marriage, but it had been channeled into supporting our partnership rather than pursuing my own vision. Maybe you're right, I said, but that doesn't change the fact that you chose to end our marriage through betrayal rather than honest conversation about what wasn't working between us. I know, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. Back inside the mansion, I found myself struggling to focus on the celebration that was continuing around me. Guests were raving about the food, the wine, the music, and the impeccable restoration of the historic property. Several potential investors had approached me about future collaborations, and a prominent travel writer was discussing the possibility of featuring the Sterling collection in an upcoming book about luxury destinations. Everything was going perfectly, but Marcus's unexpected appearance had stirred up emotions I thought I'd successfully processed and moved beyond. Catherine Williams appeared at my elbow with a glass of champagne and a concerned expression. You look like you've seen a ghost,
Everything all right. Just an unexpected visitor from my past, I said, accepting the champagne gratefully. Nothing that can't be handled. Ah, the mysterious ex-husband. I wondered when he'd make an appearance. I looked at Catherine in surprise. You know about Marcus? Darling, I'm a magazine editor. It's my job to know about the personal lives of the people I feature in my publication. I also know that you've handled your divorce with remarkable grace, and that you've built something extraordinary in the aftermath of what must have been a devastating betrayal. It was devastating at the time, I admitted, but looking back, I think it was also necessary. I might never have discovered what I was capable of if I'd remained in a marriage that was making me smaller rather than larger. Catherine raised her glass in a toast to necessary devastations and unexpected opportunities. As the evening progressed, I found myself thinking about the conversation with Marcus and Emma, about the cyclical nature of human relationships and the ways that patterns repeat themselves across generations. Marcus was starting over with a young woman who believed she could love him into becoming a better man, just as I had believed 24 years earlier. The difference was that Emma was entering their relationship with full knowledge of Marcus's capacity for deception and betrayal, while I had discovered those qualities only after they'd been turned against me. Whether that knowledge would protect her, or simply make her more determined to prove she could succeed where I had failed, remained to be seen. Around midnight, after the last guests had departed and my staff had begun the cleanup process, I found myself alone on the mansion's balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The waves were illuminated by moonlight, creating a silver pathway that stretched to the horizon, and the air carried the scent of salt and cypress trees. My phone buzzed with a text message from Diana Rodriguez, who had become one of my closest friends in the years since she'd orchestrated my legal victory over Marcus. Saw the photos from tonight's event on Instagram. Looks amazing. How did it go? I typed back quickly. Perfect evening, unexpected visitor from the past, but handled it well. Call you tomorrow. Her response came immediately. Marcus showed up, didn't he? Want me to update the restraining order paperwork? Diana's protective instincts had never fully relaxed, even though Marcus had complied with all the terms of our divorce settlement and had shown no signs of being genuinely threatening. But her vigilance was one of the reasons I felt safe to take risks in my business and personal life, knowing I had people in my corner who would fight for me if necessary. Not necessary, I texted back. Just closure, I think. He's getting remarried and wanted to apologize in person. Good for him, better for you. You've built an incredible life without him. I had built an incredible life without him. The Sterling collection was thriving beyond my wildest expectations, with a waiting list of potential guests that stretched months into the future. I'd been featured on the covers of 3 national magazines, had been invited to speak at hospitality industry conferences, and had been approached by several publishers about writing a book on luxury hotel design and management. More importantly, I'd discovered parts of myself that had been dormant during my marriage. A willingness to take creative risks, a talent for inspiring loyalty in my employees, and a capacity for building meaningful professional relationships based on mutual respect rather than romantic compromise. The loneliness that had terrified me in the immediate aftermath of my divorce had gradually transformed into solitude. I treasured time to think and plan, and dream without having to consider someone else's needs and preferences. I had close friendships with other successful women, a fulfilling relationship with my work, and the freedom to travel and explore and learn without negotiating every decision with a partner. My personal life wasn't empty, as Marcus had probably assumed when he'd made his surprise appearance tonight. I'd had several relationships over the past 2 years, including a 6-month involvement with a winemaker from Sonoma County, who'd understood my commitment to my business and had never pressured me to prioritize romance over professional success. The relationships had been fulfilling in their own ways, but none of them had made me want to give up the independence I'd fought so hard to reclaim. I was no longer looking for someone to complete me or to provide validation for my choices. I was looking for partnership between equals, mutual enhancement rather than mutual dependence. As I stood on the balcony, listening to the ocean and feeling the cool night air against my skin, I realized that Marcus's apology had given me something I hadn't known I needed: confirmation that the choices I'd made in the aftermath of our divorce had been the right ones. He'd seen what I'd built without him, and recognized that I was flourishing in ways I never could have while I was trying to be the wife he'd wanted rather than the woman I was capable of becoming. His acknowledgement didn't change the past or erase the pain he'd caused, but it validated the journey I'd taken from victim to victor, from betrayed wife to successful entrepreneur. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Rachel Morrison, Harold's daughter, who had become both a business partner and a personal friend. Saw the photos from tonight. Ocean View Manor looks absolutely stunning. Ready to discuss the Seattle expansion project when you have time. The Seattle expansion project. Rachel and I had been planning to open a Sterling Collection property in my hometown, a boutique hotel in the historic Pioneer Square district that would cater to tech executives and international travelers. It would be my return to the city where my marriage had ended and my new life had begun, but this time as a conquering hero rather than a wounded refugee. The symmetry appealed to me. I'd built my first hotel in Seattle when I was young and inexperienced, trying to prove myself in an industry that didn't take women seriously. Now I was returning as an established success, with the confidence and resources to create exactly the kind of property I'd always envisioned. Absolutely ready, I texted back to Rachel. Let's schedule a site visit for next week. As I prepared to leave the mansion and return to my hotel suite in nearby Monterey, I took one last look around the ballroom where tonight's celebration had taken place. The space was empty now, except for the cleanup crew, but I could still feel the energy of the evening, the sense of accomplishment and possibility that had filled the room. This was what I'd been building toward for the past 2 years, not just financial success or professional recognition, but the deep satisfaction that comes from creating something beautiful and meaningful entirely on your own terms. Every decision about the Sterling Collection had been mine to make, every risk had been mine to take, and every victory had been mine to claim. Marcus's unexpected appearance tonight had reminded me of the woman I used to be, the wife who had deferred her dreams and compromised her vision in the service of a partnership that had ultimately betrayed her. But it had also highlighted how completely I'd transformed myself from that woman into someone I genuinely admired and respected. The drive back to my hotel took me along the famous 17-mile drive, with its spectacular views of the Monterey Peninsula coastline. The road was nearly empty at this hour, just the occasional car carrying late-night travelers between Carmel and Monterey, and I found myself appreciating the solitude and the beauty of the landscape. In my hotel suite, I poured myself a glass of wine from a bottle that had been a gift from the winemaker I'd briefly dated, and settled into the reading chair by the window overlooking Monterey Bay. The city lights reflected on the water like scattered diamonds, and I could see the occasional fishing boat heading out for the early morning catch. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the financial reports from the evening's event, noting the positive feedback from potential investors and the strong interest from travel writers and lifestyle journalists. Ocean View Manor was already booked solid for its first 6 months of operation, with a waiting list that suggested strong demand for the unique blend of historical elegance and modern luxury that had become the Sterling Collection's signature. But beyond the immediate success of tonight's opening, I was thinking about the larger trajectory of my life and career. Where did I want to be in 5 years? What kind of legacy did I want to build? What would bring me the deepest satisfaction as I moved through my 40s and into the next phase of my personal and professional evolution? The questions didn't have simple answers, but they excited rather than intimidated me. For the first time in my adult life, I was writing my own story rather than trying to fit into someone else's narrative about what my life should look like. My phone rang, startling me from my reflections. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but given the late hour and my public profile, I was accustomed to receiving calls from reporters, business partners, and potential clients at all hours. Victoria Sterling, I answered, using the professional tone I'd perfected for handling unexpected business calls. Miss Sterling, this is Emma Larson. I'm sorry to call so late, but I got your number from the hotel's website, and I really need to talk to you. Emma. Marcus's pregnant fiancée was calling me at nearly 1 in the morning, hours after their surprise appearance at my event. Something in her voice suggested this wasn't a social call. Emma, is everything all right? Are you having medical problems? No, nothing like that. It's about Marcus. About things he told me tonight after we left your event. Her voice was shaky, tearful, nothing like the confident young woman who had defended her relationship just hours earlier. Emma, I really don't think it's appropriate for me to discuss your relationship with Marcus. You two need to work out your problems directly. Please just listen for a minute. He told me tonight that he lied about how his first marriage ended. He said you left him, not the other way around. He said you discovered he was stealing money and threatened to have him arrested if he didn't sign the divorce papers. I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar wave of anger at Marcus's continued inability to take responsibility for his actions. Even now, even with a pregnant fiancée who deserved to know the truth, he was still rewriting history to make himself the victim rather than the perpetrator. Emma, your fiancé has a complicated relationship with the truth. If you want to know what really happened in our marriage, I suggest you ask to see the court records from our divorce proceedings. They're public documents. I did. I went online tonight and found the criminal charges, the restitution orders, the evidence about his affair with that other woman. Miss Sterling, he told me you were the one who had the affair. He told me you were the one who stole money from your joint accounts to finance your hotels. The breathtaking scope of Marcus's deception took my breath away. He hadn't just lied to Emma about the basic facts of our divorce. He'd created an entirely fictional narrative that cast him as the wronged husband and me as the unfaithful criminal wife. Emma, I'm going to give you some advice that I wish someone had given me when I was your age. When someone lies to you about easily verifiable facts, they're telling you something important about their character. The question you need to ask yourself is whether you want to build a life with someone who would rather lie than take responsibility for his mistakes. But he says he loves me. He says our baby is going to be his chance to start over and be the kind of father he always wanted to be. Love, the word that had been used to justify so many betrayals, so many compromises, so many decisions to ignore obvious red flags in favor of romantic optimism. Marcus had told me he loved me right up until the moment he'd announced he was leaving me for someone else. Emma, I'm not going to tell you what to do with your life, but I will tell you this: love without honesty is just manipulation. And a man who lies about his past is very likely to lie about his future. After I hung up, I sat in my hotel suite looking out at the bay and thinking about the cycles of deception that seemed to follow Marcus wherever he went. He'd betrayed me with Cassandra, been betrayed by her in return, and was now building a new relationship on the foundation of lies he'd told to a young woman who was probably desperate enough to believe them. I felt sorry for Emma, carrying a child with a man who had proven himself incapable of sustained honesty or genuine accountability. But I also felt grateful that her situation was no longer my responsibility to manage or my problem to solve. The woman I'd been during my marriage would have felt obligated to save Emma from making the same mistakes I'd made. The woman I'd become understood that everyone had to learn their own lessons in their own time, and that my energy was better spent building my own future than trying to rescue people who weren't ready to be saved. I finished my wine and prepared for bed, looking forward to tomorrow's site visit with Rachel and the planning sessions that would bring the Sterling collection back to Seattle. It felt like coming full circle, returning to the city where my old life had ended as the architect of an entirely new existence. Marcus could keep rewriting history to avoid confronting his own failures. Emma could keep believing that love would transform a man who had already shown her who he really was. But I would keep building something beautiful and lasting on the foundation of truth and hard work, and the kind of self-respect that couldn't be taken away by anyone else's choices. The future stretched ahead of me like the moonlit ocean beyond my window, vast, beautiful, and full of possibilities that belonged entirely to me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.